In this module, we cover some specifics that apply to a Maps API for Business account. In particular, we'll define terms like client ID and cryptographic key and take a look at how to use them when sending API requests. Next, we'll take a look at the mechanisms to help secure your client-side and web service API requests. And finally, we'll walk you through some of the important sections of the Enterprise Support Portal to see some of the things you can do through the portal. Now, when you receive your welcome letter for Maps API for Business license, you will find crucial information like the client ID and the cryptographic key that's assigned to your account. And a few lines below, you will see the link to the Enterprise Support Portal followed by the end of support date for your account. And now let's see how and where to use some of these items. Let's start with client ID. Client ID is a human-readable string, typically of the format GME, followed by a hyphen, followed by a name that typically reflects the name of your organization. So it could be gme-abc.org, for example. Retake. So it could be gme-abc, for example. This client ID is included in the welcome letter, and it works like the username of your account. So all the requests that you send, whether it's client-side or server-side requests, should include the client ID as one of the parameters. By including the client ID in your requests, we're able to distinguish between your requests and that of everybody else's. And so the page views that you've purchased with your account and all the query uplifts that apply to each of the web service APIs will be available to you only when you use the client ID when making your requests. And so here are examples of how you would include the client ID when sending client-side or server-side requests. In the first example, you're bootstrapping the JavaScript API, and so along with all the other parameters like sensor and version, you will include the client parameter and the value will equal to that of your client ID. Similarly, when you're sending a server-side request like geocoding, for example, you will include the client ID and also a signature that we will get into the details of in a few more slides. Now, some watch points to take note of when working with client IDs. Firstly, a client ID is not the same as the Maps API key or the API key that you can generate over at the API console. These keys are only for non-business customers. All Maps API for Business customers will use a client ID instead of a key. And so it's not advisable to send a request that has both client and key parameters in the same request. This may cause your application to behave in an unpredictable manner. So you want to make sure that if you have been doing some development and testing using the API key in your code, one of the main things you want to make sure is that you remove this parameter and replace it with the client ID when you purchase your Maps API for Business license. Another common mistake that we see a lot is using the client ID where we expect the signature. A signature is created by encrypting the client ID with the cryptographic key, and we'll take a look at that in a few more slides. Now, let's take a look at how we can secure requests that are sent with the client ID. The APIs in the Maps API family can be broadly categorized into two groups, client-side and server-side, and we have a different mechanism to secure each of these. For client-side, we require you to enable or authorize domains from which the requests will originate to be mapped against your client ID. Whereas for server-side requests like geocoding, directions, distance, web service APIs, we use the concept of a signature to be sent together with your requests. This signature will be created with the help of the cryptographic key that is sent to you in the welcome letter. This key is very much like a password, a secret which you do not want to share with the general public. And the key is an ingredient that will be used to create a digital signature. So let's talk about client-side first and describe what enabling a domain for a client ID really means. Enabling a domain for a client ID simply associates the domain with the client ID that you've been provided with. So what that means is once you've mapped a domain or authorized a domain for a client ID, you'll be allowed to make requests. For example, load the JavaScript API from a web application that is hosted on that domain. For example, if your client ID is GME-example and you've listed these 3 domain URLs to be mapped or authorized against this client ID, only those requests that originate from any of these domains will be allowed to go through. Any other requests originating from any other domain that makes use of the client ID, that makes use of your client ID, will not be allowed to go through. Do take note that there is a maximum of 3,000 URLs that you can specify for a particular client ID. And now let's take a look at how can we add additional domains. So when you purchase your Maps API for Business account, you can provide a list of domains to be authorized or enabled against your client ID. However, at some later time in the future, you may decide to add additional domains. And we have a self-service tool that is available within the support portal that allows you to do exactly that. Here's a screenshot of the Add URL section within the support portal, and it will show you the current list of domains that have been enabled against this client ID. And you may enlist additional domains by listing them in this box and click on the Add URL. Do take note that you're only able to add 100 URLs in one particular request. And so if you have more, you want to break them up into batches. Another thing you want to take note of is that although we allow you to add domains using this self-service tool, removing of an existing authorized domain will require you to file a support ticket. And so we want you to make sure that before you add a domain to be mapped or authorized against your client ID, you've made sure that that is exactly the domain you want to support any requests to be made against the APIs. There are some guidelines when adding these URLs, and so you want to be as specific as possible. You can do that by specifying a particular port that you want to support or a particular protocol. Let's say you only want to support HTTPS and not HTTP. So you can provide that when you list down the URL inside this box. So let's say you add a URL like www.abc.org. So what that means is it will allow requests made against any of the APIs that comes out from HTTP www.abc.org or HTTPS www.abc.org. So you want to make sure that you be as specific as possible, because if you don't, all subdomains and all subparts will be allowed as sources where the API requests could be made from. For web services, we send these requests along with a digital signature, and a digital signature is a string that you can create by encrypting your request with the cryptographic key that is provided in the welcome letter. What happens is that when the Google servers receive this request along with the signature, we will use the same cryptographic key to decrypt the request and make sure that you've used the cryptographic key that was provided to encrypt the original request in the first place. This way, we're able to verify that it is you who has sent this request by using your cryptographic key, and also make sure that any hackers will not be able to modify the original request, because it would require a whole different signature to work with that modified request. Also, it is important to take note that along with the client ID that is required when sending in a request for the web service APIs, they will only work when you send a signature along with the client ID in your request. As an example, let's say I'm trying to make a static maps API request for a particular address, and among the other parameter values that I've provided, I'm requesting the image size to be 2000 by 2000. Here is my client ID, and this is the signature that I had generated. And so this will result in this particular image being fetched. However, if I remove the signature parameter, it will result in an error. Also, if I modify this original request by changing the size parameter from 2000 by 2000 to 2000 by 2001, and I keep the same signature, this will still result in an error, making sure that we will require you to send a whole new signature that you would have to create using your cryptographic key, even if the request changes slightly. Just to give you an overview of the main ingredients and steps involved in creating a digital signature, first and foremost, you must have a cryptographic key. Again, this will be available from your welcome letter. You need to use this cryptographic key and the original request. We'll need to process this a bit, and a programming language of your choice to encrypt the request using the key. So if you were using Python, it could look something like this. You will decode the cryptographic key and use that decoded key to encrypt the processed URL. What I mean by process is we remove the protocol, we remove the domain part, and we use a hashing algorithm to create this digital signature. Again, before we can use the result of this particular step, we will need to make sure that the signature is encoded before we can append it to the original request string with the signature parameter. And like I mentioned earlier, that if you change the original request, which is one of the ingredients that goes into creation of the digital signature, that means that the signature itself will have to change, and so you will have to repeat the same steps whenever your original request changes. For example, if you're trying to geocode the addresses 1600 Amphitheatre Parkway and 1601 Amphitheatre Parkway, these are two unique addresses, and so each one of them will have a unique signature that has to be created and sent along with either of these requests for the request to be correctly processed and qualified. Some important things to remember when working with cryptographic key. One of the most common mistakes that we see a lot of customers do is using the cryptographic key where you were supposed to provide a signature. Remember, the cryptographic key is not a signature. It is an ingredient that goes into the creation of a digital signature. And so for whatever reason, if you think your cryptographic key has been compromised, you want to file a support ticket on the support portal and get this replaced with a new cryptographic key. You are required to treat this cryptographic key just like any other password, so you want to make sure that you do not share this key with anyone, you do not store it in the clear, for example, include it in the script tag along with your client ID, for example. Now, with the Maths for Business account, besides all the good stuff like higher quotas and limits and SLA, you have access to a support portal, and I want to walk you through some of the important sections and show you some of the things you can do over at the support portal. Firstly, here is the URL where you'll see the login page to the support portal. One of the things that people assume is when you receive the welcome letter, you already have access to the support portal by default, which is not right. This setup has to be done separately, and so if you need guidance on how to set up your account over at the support portal, you can make use of this "How do I access" link, which provides you more guidance on how to go about setting up your account over at the support portal. Once you gain access to the support portal, you can do a lot of things like file support tickets, generate usage report, and look at detailed analytics. One of the things we saw in one of the earlier slides was be able to add additional domains to secure your client-side requests. You also have access to some of the latest updates, news announcements, and also some documentation that is available within the resources section. And you're also able to take a look at some of the important hotline numbers should you need to make use of those in urgent situations. When you log into the support portal, this is the main welcome page that you will see, where we post some of the latest news and announcements pertaining to all the assets and products that have been mapped against your account. If you click on the Cases tab, you will see a list of support tickets that you have filed in the past, and you will also be able to see the status of these tickets. The Create New Case button right here allows you to create a new support case, and one of the things that we find helpful, along with all the other details that you can provide when you file a new support case, is the steps to reproduce the problem, or you can even provide us with access to your web application and some of these steps to get to the error that you're facing to help us better understand your problem and be able to give you a good solution. Under the Resources tab, you'll be able to access some pretty good documentation and articles for our various Geo products. Some of the interesting articles that come to mind are the upgrade guide from version 2 to version 3 of the JavaScript API. Another good article is the geocoding strategies. You can make use of the usage report link to take a look at the page views and the usage of the QPS and QPD limits for your APIs. When you click on the usage report, it brings you to the client-side report view. And so this table summarizes the various client-side APIs and the page view numbers. If you click on this particular link, it will bring you to the web services usage report, which looks something like this. Now, for the web services, you need to specify which particular API you want to look at. For example, if you've been using a lot of geocoding requests, you can specify using this drop-down list to generate the usage report for the geocoding version 3 API. Apart from the usage graph, you can also take a look at the table that appears at the bottom of the page that breaks down the results into various categories like OK, 0 results, over query limit. This gives you a better indication of how many requests succeeded, how many requests failed, and what was the exact reason of the failure of that particular request. Now, in both sections, you will notice this particular drop-down list for channel ID. Now, when you purchase a Maps API for Business account, you will get a client ID in the welcome letter, and you may have one or more applications that intend to use a Google map. And so chances are, instead of buying multiple Maps for Business accounts, you will use the same account because, again, chances are the number of page views you had purchased with that account would suffice for these number of applications. Let's say you have a public-facing store locator application, and you also have another internal application that is being used by the marketing team to display some sort of map and a bunch of overlays on top of that map. What I'm trying to say is, in both these applications, you will end up using the same client ID. And so what happens is, when you generate the client side and the web service usage report, you will see an aggregate amount of usage by all the applications that had made use of the client ID. However, if you want to have a better breakdown by individual application, you can use what we call the channel parameter. And this is how you will use the channel parameter in your requests. When you send your API request along with your client ID, you can use a channel parameter and some value that makes sense for that particular application. For example, marketing, if it's being used by the marketing department. And so what's going to happen is, as you start sending these requests for a specified period of time, after which you go back to the support portal, you can make use of this channel ID filter drop-down functionality to filter based on the channel value that you had used when sending your requests. This way, you will be able to generate usage report only for that particular channel. So let's say you have a bunch of applications using the same client ID, you could use values like app1, app2, app3 for your channel parameter when making requests from these various applications. One thing to take note of is that this channel parameter is not meant for individual user or IP tracking, but rather be able to track usage generated by individual applications that make use of the same client ID. If you have more than one person working with the support portal, you can add more entries for each of these people within the support portal. Here is again something that we had seen earlier, the add URL section, through which you can authorize additional domains from which you want to allow client-side requests to originate from. Last but not the least, we have the analytics section, which is a relatively new section added to the support portal. It provides feedback on how users have been interacting with your map applications.